Good evening, everybody. The nation is in turmoil. There is division, there is anger, there are protests, there are counter protests, there is violence, there are deaths. Where do we go from here? How do we return to respect, to civility, to trust? What can lead us to a just and peaceful society? Perhaps today's scripture readings have the answer for us. In my 3 points for today, I want to talk about what God calls His people to. Where is God in all of this? And how can we answer the call that we can actually create just and peaceful societies? So my first point, I want to talk about the remnant. It's like the people of God, the remnant, and what that means in the book of the prophet Zephaniah. Zephaniah was a prophet during the reign of King Josiah between 640 and 609 BC. And he was a contemporary of the great prophet Jeremiah. But unlike Jeremiah, who was taken from among the folks, Zephaniah was a court prophet, and he was a relative of the previous king Hezekiah. Now, the context of his ministry was the social, the moral, and the idolatrous corruption lingering in the kingdom. There was widespread social injustice. The poor were trampled by the economic oppression of corrupt officials. And idolatry and apathy towards God's law was rampant. And believe me, I'm not trying to read today's situation into Isaiah's prophecy. I'm not doing that at all. You can read any commentary on Zephaniah, and that's the context within which he prophesies. There was a total disregard for justice and truth. It is in this context that Zephaniah says, I will leave a remnant in your midst. Who are the remnant people, and what does God say about the remnant? Zephaniah calls them a people humble and lowly. Humble and lowly. The remnant have certain qualities. They're a people of a certain character. Zephaniah says that the remnant seek justice and humility. They take refuge in the Lord. They do no wrong, speak no lies, and do not have a deceitful tongue. In other words, the remnant were God's people who, centering their lives on God's law, would live a life of humility, of righteousness, of truth. That's the character of the people that God calls to Himself. But there is a remnant also much later in the time of Jesus. The society of Jesus was not very different from the time of Zephaniah. The Roman Empire, much can be said about the empire, but it was sustained by absolute power, unmitigated intolerance, and brutal violence. Even the religious establishment was tainted with legalism and hypocrisy. And Jesus was aware of the injustice, the corruption, the apathy, and the hypocrisy that plagued both religion and society. Many of Jesus' teachings counter them. And in this context of the Roman Empire, Jesus could have gone in any direction. But Jesus did something in line with Zephaniah's prophecy. He proposed a transformative ethic for living. Jesus offered a countercultural model for just and peaceful living, for creating just and peaceful societies. And this is what he said: "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the clean of heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the persecuted." Now, Jesus did not preach the Beatitudes to the winds, right? He called ordinary people to join hands with him. In today's gospel reading, Matthew says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. So not everybody went. Disciples came to him. The crowds were at the foot of the mountain. The disciples came to Jesus and he taught them. In other words, just like Zephaniah, Jesus was forming a remnant for his times. Yes, everything around him was terrible. But Jesus formed a remnant, only now they are called disciples. To them, he taught this new ethic, his new way for just and peaceful societies. It was based on simplicity, on humility, on meekness, of mercy, righteousness, and peacemaking. It would not be easy. They could and they would be persecuted. But that's the cost of discipleship. In fact, there is a blessedness in all of it. And finally, in my third point, I want to say that all the scripture readings today, they don't merely teach us something. Like when you come to church, sometimes you hear a parable, and there is something be taught to the parable, and you draw the moral of the story. What does the story tell us? But that's not today's scripture. Yes, it's a teaching, but more than anything else, it's a clamoring call. It's a call. And there are two things to be said about the call as we hear it. First, in last week's gospel, we had heard that Jesus called his first 4 disciples. They were not from the temple in Jerusalem. They were not from the synagogues in Nazareth or Capernaum. They were not from among the national and religious leaders. They were not from among the social elites. They were neither seemingly pious people. They were simple fisher folk. As Paul says in today's second reading, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise. And God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something. God calls the weak, the simple, the humble, and the lowly. And God calls them because God can do more with them than with the powerful, the arrogant, and the boastful. The second part of this call is that in the gospel reading there are two groups of people, right? There was the crowd that was at the foot of the mountain, and there were the disciples who went up the mountain with Jesus. Based on the call of the apostles that Jesus gave, like the first four lowly people, I would say, and this is totally my interpretation, this is not from any scripture commentary, I believe that what happened at that mountain was simply that it was the weak, the simple, the humble, the lowly who went up in the first place. They were the ones who heard the call. The powerful, the arrogant, the boastful, and those steeped in self-sufficiency stayed at the foot of the mountain. So folks, either we are the crowd at the foot of the mountain, or we are disciples on the top of the mountain with Jesus. Either we are remnant, or we belong to the world. Either we follow the ethic that Jesus proposes, or we are the masters of our own making. There is a choice to be made. There's a call to be heard. There is a life to be lived. So I want to end with Paul's words. Consider your calling, brothers and sisters. Indeed, let us consider our call.